New filings are up 53% over last year, and ULP filings, unfair labor practice charges, are up 19%.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Last Week in Southern Labor is a segment that we do every week, mostly, where we talk about what happened in the labor movement in the South. We pull the information from Jonah Furman's newsletter, Who Gets the Bird, which compiles all this information for the entire United States. So if you want to see what's going on outside the South, then you should subscribe to said newsletter. That is whogetsthebird.substack.com. With that, let's jump into new organizing for the week of October 2nd through October 8th. And we'll start with a big picture from the NLRB's recent report on its past fiscal year, which just ended. New filings are up 53% over last year, and ULP filings are up 19% from last year. ULPs are unfair labor practice charges. So it is really true that we are in the middle of an uptick in NLRB activity, but it's important to note that there were more filings in 2016 than in the past year, and that was no high watermark. One way, according to Jonah, to think about what's happening is that pre-pandemic, we were at the beginning of a rising tide of union activity. 2018, with the mass teacher strikes, was the strikingest year since 1986, and October 2019 had far more workers on strike than in so-called Striketober of 2021. So one way to look at this is that we were in the middle of a rising tide of union activity pre-pandemic that was interrupted by COVID and is now resuming. Maybe the biggest takeaway from the NLRB report is that they have lost half of their field staff in the last 20 years and have had stagnant funding for the past 9. That's important because if we're going to route new union activity through an administrative bureaucracy, it being under-resourced is going to become a really, really big problem. Also, 2 respiratory service techs at the U.S. Army post in Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, are joining Operating Engineers Local 320. Charlottesville, Virginia is the latest public sector jurisdiction in Virginia to pass a collective bargaining law, combined with a raise for bus drivers. In Alexandria, Virginia, where a similar ordinance was passed a year and a half ago, nearly 200 city workers are now members of AFSCME Local 3001. Elsewhere in the public sector, the National Park Service is facing a complaint from AFGE that management illegally initiated the decertification of a unit of workers along the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia and North Carolina. We only had one win last week, and that was 78 truck drivers for wholesale beverage distributor Republic in Houston, Texas, voting 55-12 to join Teamsters Local 988. Lots of strikes and bargaining updates. First up, the rail negotiations that just 3 weeks ago were national headlines have slowed to a trickle of news by design, but are not yet over. This week's small update is that a fourth of the dozen rail unions has voted to ratify their tentative agreement, and with the ATDA voting by 64% to accept the deal. We're getting results from 3 more unions this week, with the Brotherhood of Maintenance and Way employees having voted since the newsletter came out to reject the agreement, which is a very big deal. Members of that union have set a strike deadline slightly after the midterm elections. Members are still raising questions about the process so far, with at least one local chairman in the Machinists District Lodge 19 writing a scathing letter to that union's leadership about the process. Male prisoners across Alabama continue to refuse work to push for reforms of living conditions, life sentencing, parole, and time served. 450 steelworker members at Westrock's Cottonton, Alabama mill are still locked out. The workers rejected a contract offer with an eye-watering $28,000 ratification bonus as they hold out for penalties for excessive overtime. This week also marked 18 months on the picket line for UMWA strikers at Warrior Met, and Erica Willis wrote about it for Labor Notes. You should check that out. Starbucks Workers United went on strike in Houston, Texas against the national firing wave, and in Columbia, South Carolina for the company's unilateral decision to drop COVID isolation pay. 400 workers at Graphic Packaging in Domino, Texas, with steelworkers Local 1148 and 1149 authorized to strike against two-tier pay back in June over a contract that expired back in April. But the union says a strike is still not imminent. Elsewhere in large grocery contracts, something like 17,000 Teamsters will be voting on the first ever national Costco contract. Yet another airline contract has been submitted for federal mediation, this time that of the Airline Pilots Association pilots at FedEx Express. This is somewhere between checking a box and declaring a light impasse, but it's worth tracking for sure. In political fights, Dave Jameson at the Huffington Post has a very useful piece breaking down what's at stake in Glacier Northwest, which is the case the Supreme Court just announced it plans to hear during this session. In the most dire reading, we could be headed towards a scenario in which private sector unions are liable for damages incurred by an employer during a strike, which, depending on how you slice it, would basically make effective strikes impossible, since the vast majority of the leverage workers hold is in inflicting economic pain on employers. Of course. The NLRB also ruled this week that dues checkoff provisions should be considered part of the status quo that cannot be unilaterally changed once a contract expires. So that's a little bit of good news to contrast with the potentially world-ending news from the Supreme Court. We get a mention in the newsletter this week. He says the Valley Labor Report had researcher Chris Boner on to talk about his fantastic report, Labor's Fortress of Finance. Boner's report is one of the rare, wide-ranging, deeply researched critical takes on the labor movement as a whole that both activists and leadership alike should take a long, hard look at. And finally, in internal union politics, the UFCW reform effort, Essential Workers for a Democratic UFCW, has launched with a new website with lots of resources on their diagnosis of what the union's getting wrong and a slate of resolutions they hope to pass at the 2023 convention. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.